The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, witnesses, your prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. We have many members of our subcommittee who are also on the Judiciary Committee, including Ranking Member Deutsch, and there's an important markup happening as we speak, so you might see a lot of members moving back and forth, and we appreciate the time that they can spare to come over here. Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Last month, this subcommittee convened a hearing on the challenges and opportunities for the United States-Saudi Arabia bilateral relationship. Today, we focus on the U.S.-Qatar relationship and Qatar's relationship with its neighbors. I think it's important to note that this rift in the Gulf is not new. Catherine Bauer, a former senior-level official at the Treasury Department, stated earlier this month at a think tank event, quote, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have sought for years to kind of galvanize Qatar's actions against the terrorist financiers that were operating and continue to operate in Qatar, end quote. Qatar has been known to be a permissive environment for terror financing, reportedly funding U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organizations such as Hamas, as well as several extremist groups operating in Syria. In 2014, the former deputy director of the CIA, David Cohen, called out Qatar publicly, along with the Kuwaitis, because, according to him, quote, the private engagement with these countries had not achieved what we were trying to achieve, end quote. In fact, Qatar has openly housed Hamas leaders, Taliban leaders, and has several individuals who have been sanctioned by our U.S. State Treasury Department, and it has failed to prosecute them. At least one high-ranking Qatari official provided support to the mastermind of the 9/11 terror attacks against our country, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Then, of course, there is Khalifa Mohammed, who is a U.S., EU, and UN-designated international terrorist for his role in financing al-Qaeda and the 9/11 mastermind. In 2008, he was tried and convicted in absentia by Bahrain for his terrorist activity and arrested later that year by Qatar, only to be released by the Qataris 6 months later and then openly financed by Doha. Can anyone guess what Khalifa Mohammed has been up to these days? He was implicated in terror financing activities in 2012, but more recently, he has been alleged to be financing and supporting terror in both Iraq and Syria, with no response from the Qatari government. Hamas leader Khalid Mashal also made Doha his headquarters for years, while the Qatari's government support, and even the Muslim Brotherhood has received significant support from Qatar. Of course, not all of this is supported by the government in Doha. Many individuals and charities in Qatar have been known to raise large sums of money for al-Qaeda, the Nusra Fund, Hamas, and even ISIS. In Qatar, there are 3 buckets: terror financing by the government, terror financing done in Qatar through their own citizens that the government may not know about, and terror financing in Qatar that the government knows about but does nothing to stop it. According to the 2015 country reports on terrorism, the State Department stated, quote, entities and individuals within Qatar continue to serve as a source of financial support for terrorist and violent extremist groups, particularly regional al-Qaeda affiliates such as the Nusra Front, end quote. There is no excuse for openly harboring terrorists and supporting groups that seek to harm our allies. And the excuse by Qatar that it is harboring these nefarious actors is because the U.S. asked them to, no longer stands up. Qatar should not be continuing this reckless policy due to past mistakes from previous Republican and Democratic administrations. We must not allow for our airbase to be used as a means to justify this sort of behavior and our lack of a more appropriate response. Doha's behavior must change the status quo, and if it does not, it risks losing our cooperation on the airbase. The truth of the matter is that none of the Gulf countries are without their issues. All of the nations have been involved in funding different groups at some point that we would not approve of. But it seems like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are making progress at a faster rate, while Qatar is making some progress but still is lagging slowly behind. According to the Congressional Research Service, quote, in October 2016, Danielle Glazer, then Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing in the Office for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, told a Washington, D.C. research institute that over the past decade, Qatar has made less progress in countering terrorism financing than had Saudi Arabia, end quote. We must analyze the totality of our relationship with these Gulf countries. While Qatar only helps to facilitate our operations at our airbase, the UAE, for example, has spent 12 years with us fighting alongside in Afghanistan and has been involved in counterterrorism operations with the U.S. in Libya. So moving forward, one outcome that I hope comes out of this dispute is for the Gulf countries to work closely with our Treasury Department's Financial Action Task Force to root out and disrupt terror financing streams. This uneasy time may just be an opportunity for us to take a long, hard look at how, and for some, if, we can effectively address and stop terror financing in the region and ultimately defeat the extremism that threatens the security of us all. And with that, I turn to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch, for his statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being back before our committee. I thank the chairman for convening today's timely hearing to explore our relationship with Qatar at a moment of great instability in the region. The ongoing diplomatic rift between Qatar and its Gulf neighbors is not good for the parties to the conflict, it's not good for the region, and it's not good for American interests. It is a distraction from today's most pressing challenges: Iran's destabilizing activities, the conflict in Syria, and the spread of terrorism. For most Americans who expect conflicts in the Middle East to fall along sectarian lines or between competing regional hegemons, it is confusing to see Sunni Arab neighbors in conflict. But this is a dispute over longstanding grievances, over Qatar's support financially and through its state-owned Al Jazeera news station for actors and groups that Qatar's neighbors, and in many cases the United States, see as deeply problematic. This feud, like others in the region, is a nuanced and deeply complex matter, and our relationship with Qatar is no less complex. The tiny but immensely wealthy nation pursues an ambitious foreign policy of close relations with all actors in the region. Unfortunately, this includes terror groups like Hamas and the Afghan Taliban. Qatar has served as a financial and political lifeline for Hamas's devastating rule in Gaza since the terror group took over more than a decade ago. Qatar has sent hundreds of millions of dollars into the Gaza Strip, provides safe haven in Doha for Hamas leader Khalid Mashal, and helped legitimize Hamas rule in 2012 when the emir became the first international leader to visit Hamas-led territory. Qatar has also supported other dangerous groups in the region, including sending advanced weaponry and financing to extremist elements in Syria and Libya. And Al Jazeera has given voice to clerics calling for suicide attacks against Americans and Israelis. These realities are troubling. But Qatar is also a close partner in our fight against terrorism in the region. Doha hosts and helps fund the largest U.S. military facility in the Middle East, essentially our forward operating base for U.S. Central Command. It is from this base that we supported the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and are today flying airstrikes against ISIS. Qatar has also helped serve as regional mediator, oftentimes to the benefit of the United States. Qatar has helped broker ceasefires between Hamas and Israel during periods of intense fighting. The Qataris also helped secure the release of Peter Theo Curtis, an American hostage held for nearly 2 years by the al-Qaeda-linked Nusra Front in Syria, just days after the tragic beheading of fellow American journalist James Foley. Qatar has also provided the U.S. with valuable and actionable intelligence on the financing streams for ISIS, and has begun taking steps to hold Qataris accountable for terror financing. But they've got a lot more to do. While they've begun prosecuting Qataris for sending money to terror groups, they have done so in secret, hardly an effective deterrent, and it is unclear whether the outcomes of these prosecutions have led to any significant jail time or penalty. I was pleased to see the signing of a new memorandum of understanding with Secretary Tillerson earlier this month on terror financing, but we don't yet know the details of how this agreement will be implemented, and we wait to see the results. Madam Chairman, it is important to note also that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and other nations, now isolated in Qatar, face challenges as well. 2 weeks ago, our subcommittee held a similar hearing on our relationship with Saudi Arabia, in which we explored both our strategic partnership as well as our deep concern over Saudi Arabia's slow progress on human rights and continued exporting of fundamentalist ideology. Today's hearing should not be about determining who is right. Today's hearing should rather make it clear that this fighting among partners does not advance America's interests. We should be pushing for unity among our allies to fight common threats. We should be pushing all of our partners in the region to cut off funding to terror groups. We should be urging every leader to curtail hate speech and improve the records on human rights, including treating women as equal members of society. Madam Chairman, I hope that today we can assess our relationship with Qatar thoughtfully. I hope our witnesses can help us unpack how past diplomatic rifts between Qatar and its Gulf neighbors can inform our path forward. And I hope that we can review the major demands made on Qatar to reduce relations with Iran, shut down the Turkish military base, sever all ties to terror organizations, including the Muslim Brotherhood, and shut down Al Jazeera, to understand the motivations behind these demands and in an effort to see how a resolution might actually come. I trust that our witnesses today will lead us in an interesting and worthwhile conversation. And I appreciate them being here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. And now we will turn to our members for any opening remarks they might have, starting with Mr. Cook of California.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is going to be a very interesting hearing. It's almost similar to the one we had with Turkey, friend or foe. And obviously, has already been discussed, some of the issues are going to come up, the relationship with Hamas, Taliban, financing, and everything else. But now there's a new wrinkle, and that is the World Cup and the North Korean workers that are going to be paid for by that government there, with the money going back to North Korea. That is probably going to be used to finance more missile research. And I don't think I have to tell the panel or anybody here that this is an even more troubling scenario than some of the other. And we're talking about a large number of North Koreans, including the North Korean military. They're going to be working on that. And I hope that our panel will also discuss that, as well as the other issues that were just raised. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Suzy of New York.
Mr. Swazi, thank you so much,
Swazi,
Madam Chair.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay, I'm used to that for a long time now. Anyway, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, I want to thank you so much for holding this hearing. It's very timely. It's very difficult for many of us to untangle all the complicated relationships that exist in this region. We simply don't have the background that the witnesses do, and that's why we're so appreciative of them being here to testify today. But between the religious disputes and the tribal and family relationships and the historic disputes and people's economic interests, it's sometimes difficult to untangle who the different parties are. No one in the region really has clean hands. And we need to figure out how to promote our agenda in America and throughout the West, which is that we have to stand strong and hard against people who use propaganda and hate speech and economic warfare to promote extremism and violence. So I'm excited to be here today and to listen to what the witnesses have to say. Thank you.
Gentlemen, the chair now recognizes Mr. Zeldin for 5 minutes.
1 minute.
1 minute. These are 1 minute still we're doing. Sorry, I've just taken over the chair. Mr. Zeldin, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I'm very much looking forward to today's hearing, listening to our witnesses, and being able to ask questions and getting feedback. A lot of great thoughts are already shared. I especially like the ranking member's opening testimony. He really touched on so much of what I, too, care deeply about. Recently, I was in Qatar, and I found them to be very welcoming. They were going as far out of their way as possible to make progress in our relationship. We visited the military base that was there, and our service members were well taken care of in a good strategic location. And at the same exact time, I'm greatly concerned by the welcoming atmosphere that exists for Hamas. And I just want to better understand the future of this relationship and the reasons why the reality exists as it does right now in 2017. So thank you again for doing this hearing. I look forward to the testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Zeldin. Chair now recognizes Mr. Liu for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. There have been a series of allegations between Qatar and the countries that are imposing a blockade, and it's hard for me to figure out what is true and what is false. But let me tell you what I do see. I do see a blockade that has resulted in some cruel consequences. From what I've read, you have families now being separated based on national origin, and that to me is highly troubling. I also see a Trump administration that is sending very mixed signals. At the same time, the Secretary of State is saying de-escalate, do not blockade. You have the president doing the opposite, essentially claiming credit for this blockade. And then you have all of a sudden the United States selling $12 billion worth of fighter jets to Qatar. We'd love to see the panel clarify that, and I want you to tell us not only what our policy towards Qatar should be, but what it actually is right now. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for 1 moment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It seems like only yesterday that a president said you're either with us or against us, and the world said, oh, it's too simple. But I think as we evaluate Qatar and the other Gulf states, we have to ask that basic question, is Qatar with us? Are they moving toward being more with us? Are they cooperating? Are they more cooperating? Are they moving toward Iran? Are they moving away from the U.S.? These are questions that I believe that we're going to be asking today, that I'm hoping to hear throughout the day, because I believe that although you're either with us or against us, there are shades of gray in all of our allies in the region. It's clear that Turkey has been moving away from us since 2003. It is clear that Qatar has not been the best of actors when it comes to taking away funding from those who support terrorism, and it's clear that if they are moving with us, we need to have that demonstrated, just as we ask Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others to demonstrate on a regular basis. And thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would want to join with the statement of Mr. Liu. I think what we've got to talk about here is the issue of fairness, and we need to make sure, I think that when you talk about Qatar and the other countries in the region, we as the United States, I don't think should be picking and choosing. We should be talking because we need them all. And we need to figure out how we work collectively together. Qatar has been, I think it's clear, to show that they've done some things that have been very good for the United States with our military base, trying to make sure that working with us in regards to the war on terror. And I think that what needs to happen here, and especially if we talk about Qatar, we need to bring in as a committee the individuals from both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, because there's deep dialogue and conversation that we can have with them to talk about the region and the people that they've asked, Qatar being one, to do certain things on behalf of the United States. And if that is the case, then those individuals should not be held responsible if they were working cooperatively with us. So I look forward to hearing the testimony from the witnesses, and I think that we just need to make sure that we have a level playing field here.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks, for your opening statement. We'll now turn to our witnesses. I would first like to welcome back Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who is the Senior Vice President of Research for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Dr. Schanzer served as a counterterrorism analyst at the Department of the Treasury, and prior to that, worked as a research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome back, Dr. Schanzer. I'd also like to welcome back Dr. Matthew Levitt, who directs the Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Previously, Dr. Levitt served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and before that, as an FBI counterterrorism analyst. We are glad to have you back with us today, Dr. Levitt. Finally, I would like to welcome Ilan Goldenberg, who is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Prior to CNAS, Mr. Goldenberg served as the Chief of Staff to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at the U.S. Department of State. From 2012 to 2013, Mr. Goldenberg served as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee covering Middle East issues. In that capacity, he acted as one of the lead drafters of the Syria Transition Support Act, which provided additional authorities to arm the Syrian opposition. The bill passed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in May of 2013, and I thank you for being here with us today. Dr. Schanzer, we will begin with you for your opening statement.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for the opportunity to testify. As many of you know, FDD has been producing research and analysis on Qatar since the eruption of the Arab Spring in 2011. Our critique has been consistent. We've pointed to Qatari support for Hamas, the Taliban, jihadists in Syria, jihadists in Libya, and the Muslim Brotherhood. We've been critical of Qatar for the invective broadcast on state-owned Al Jazeera. We have tracked the many reports suggesting that Qatar has paid ransom to terrorism groups. And we have noted through the work of my colleague David Andrew Weinberg that Qatar has failed to take action against U.S. and UN-designated terrorist financiers. In my written testimony, I document these problems, and I'm happy to discuss them further. But for a moment, I'd like to address how Qatar has responded to the allegations against it. After ignoring criticism from think tanks like FDD for the better part of a decade, Qatar now claims it is being unfairly singled out. To be sure, the other Gulf countries have their problems. A recent State Department report noted that UN-designated terrorist financiers continue to operate in Kuwait. Saudi Arabia continues to finance the spread of Wahhabism, and the entire Gulf suffers from a democracy deficit. But to understand why Qatar is identified first among Gulf states for terrorism financing, just imagine for a moment that you're a policeman and you've just watched 5 cars speed past you going 80 miles an hour. And zooming past them is a red Ferrari going 90 miles an hour. Which car would you pull over? Well, that Ferrari is Qatar. Indeed, Qatar's support is overt, it is egregious, and it is brazen. As the Gulf crisis is dragged on, Qatar has also been defiant, insisting its definition of terrorism differs from that of its critics. This is a particularly poor defense from a country claiming to be an American ally in the war on terrorism. As for the current crisis between Qatar and its neighbors, the Saudis and the Emiratis have been engaged in a fierce competition with Qatar for years. They attempt to outdo one another through foreign investment, domestic businesses, media interest, lobbying in Western capitals, and other soft power. Since the Arab Spring, however, that rivalry has boiled over. Both sides have thrown their support behind various proxies representing their interest in the Middle East. The Qataris back the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist actors, and for their part, the Saudis and the Emiratis are working to preserve the Arab world order, pushing for stability at the expense of the possibility for reform. These two visions of the Middle East are fundamentally at odds with one another. The wise U.S. policy is not to back one Gulf state or another. We must rather pursue policies ensuring that terrorism finance in the Gulf comes to an end. I offer you the following suggestions. First, Congress should assess whether Qatar should continue to host Al Udeid, our most significant air base in the Middle East. Fighting our war on terrorism from Qatar sends a convoluted message to our allies in the region. Congress should work with the Justice Department to ensure that Qatar not only adopts laws to combat terrorism financing, but also fully implements them. Congress should consider passing the bipartisan Stop Terrorist Operational Resources and Money, or STORM Act of 2017. The bill, which was introduced in the Senate and not yet in the House, could label Qatar and other countries as jurisdictions of terrorism financing concern. Congress should press the State Department, pursuant to the State Department Authorization Act, to issue its report on which states paid ransom to terrorists over the last year. Congress should press for full implementation of the Export Administration Act, subjecting countries like Qatar that host terrorist operatives to certain licensing requirements for dual-use goods. Congress, of course, must continue to monitor Qatar's neighbors. Indeed, even if Qatar's problems were resolved tomorrow, the Gulf would remain an area of significant concern for terrorism finance. Finally, I believe it's time we have a frank discussion about Gulf money in Washington. Those who feed from this trough are often unable to engage honestly about the policies and behaviors of their benefactors, even when they fly in the face of U.S. interests. Indeed, I would be curious to hear how many of you have been approached by lobbyists since the Gulf crisis began, let alone the lead up to today's hearing. These are the issues, there are issues rather, that I did not address in this testimony. If I missed anything you wish to discuss, I'm happy to answer your questions. And on behalf of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I thank you again for inviting me to testify.
Thank you, Dr. Schanzer. Dr. Levitt, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and assess the U.S.-Qatar relationship and Qatari counterterrorism efforts to date. Qatar's been a longtime ally of the United States and hosts the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East. But the U.S. has also long criticized the Qatari government for its lax counterterrorism policies, in particular, shortcomings regarding efforts to combat terror financing. Moving forward, it is critical to bring this Gulf crisis to a close, and the best way to do that would be to find face-saving but substantive and verifiable ways for Qatar to address the most serious shortcomings in its counterterrorism and counter-extremism posture. Some of the recent accusations made against Qatar are exaggerated, but many of the claims against Qatar are substantive and focus on long-simmering issues that Doha should have addressed a long time ago. In recent years, Qatar has maintained an open-door policy for a wide range of Islamist extremist groups, from Hamas to the Taliban and others. Most disturbing, however, is the tolerance for fundraising and support for al-Qaeda's Syria branch al-Nusra. While Qatar has made previous efforts to halt terror financing, the efficacy of these efforts is questionable. For example, in 2014, the State Department credited Qatar with shutting down Saad al-Kabi's online fundraising platform for al-Qaeda in Syria called Madad al-Sham. But the following year, the U.S. Treasury designated al-Kabi, who was still operating as a financial supporter of al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate, the al-Nusra Front. Al-Kabi came up again in the context of the 2017 designation of a Kuwait-based terror financier, Mohammed al-Anizi. Evidently, al-Kabi continued to provide funding for Nusra even after Qatar supposedly shut down this fundraising platform in 2014, 3 years earlier, putting a pretty big question mark over the integrity of Qatar's measures to stop terror financing. Doha has been particularly sketchy on the issue of the prosecution of terrorism financiers in Qatari courts. According to the State Department's 2015 country reports, Doha had made efforts to prosecute significant terrorist financiers. As of 2016, Qatar had prosecuted 5 terrorist financiers: Ibrahim al-Bakr, Saad al-Kabi, Abdul Latif al-Kawari, Abdul Rahman al-Nuaimi, and Khalifa al-Subai. It is now clear that of these, 2 were acquitted. 1 was convicted but acquitted on appeal, and 1 was convicted in absentia. As a result, none were in jail when the current intra-Gulf spat broke out, though the ones still resident in Qatar are reportedly under surveillance. According to recent reports, some new arrests may have been made since the current crisis began, likely involving some of those previously tried in Qatari courts. Qatar's lack of transparency about these cases led to much speculation about the country's commitment to these cases. And it's worth noting that just recently, the director of the Qatari Government Communications Office said, and I quote, "All individuals with links to terrorism in Qatar have been prosecuted," which would mean that the total number of suspects is 5, which is not the case. Let me give you just a couple of examples of this odd history. This would have been the second time that Ibrahim al-Bakr was convicted following his 2000 arrest, in which he was subsequently released from prison after he promised not to do terrorist activity in Qatar. Or consider Khalifa al-Subai, who was originally arrested in January of 2008 in Bahrain for financing terrorism, undergoing terrorist training, facilitating the travel of others abroad to receive terrorist training, and more. He was arrested again in March 2008 by Qatar and served a 6-month term in prison. He was supposedly under surveillance after he was released. But in 2015, the UN Committee on al-Qaeda Sanctions updated his listing with new information, which is no small matter because it required a new vote of the full UN Security Council, and reported that al-Subai had resumed terrorist activity. According to the committee, and I quote, "After his release, al-Subai reconnected with al-Qaeda financiers and facilitators in the Middle East and resumed organizing funds in support of al-Qaeda." It's important to note that while terror finance prosecutions are difficult cases and acquittals are part of a normally functioning justice system, these are not the only tools available to Qatari officials to deal with terror financiers, effectively serving as regional bundlers of terror funding from donors throughout the region to al-Qaeda and Syria in particular. The first big test for Qatar will be to populate the domestic designation list just created by Qatar's emir and to put people on that list. The U.S. just signed an MOU on counterterror financing with Qatar. It created a whole bunch of new authorities. These authorities need to be implemented in full. Qatar has a history of past counterterrorism and counterterrorism-related laws in 2004, 2006, 2010, 2014. They were either not implemented or not implemented in full, and so therefore this time we have to make sure that these are done and done effectively. Moving forward, the most important thing is that Qatar populate this designation list in a transparent manner, starting with those individuals already designated by the U.S. Treasury and the United Nations who remain at large and may be continuing to fund and provide material support to al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. There are several other recommendations I make in my written statement. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today and look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt, for your testimony. I now turn to Mr. Goldenberg for your opening statement.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the U.S.-Qatar relationship and the implications of the current divisions within the Gulf Cooperation Council. My objective with this testimony is not to recount the various moves and counter-moves each side has made in the past few weeks since the crisis erupted. Instead, I will provide some context as to what created this situation, the implications for U.S. interests, and the possible way ahead. Qatar is a complex American partner, to say the least. On the one hand, it has pursued a policy that has included building relations with a number of actors the United States finds problematic, including extremist groups in Syria, the Taliban, Hamas, and the Muslim Brotherhood. This approach has been part of an independent and sometimes provocative Qatari foreign policy that has chafed on some of its Gulf neighbors. And in some instances, these neighbors have viewed Qatari actions as interfering in their own internal affairs, which has infuriated them and been a major reason for their recent actions. From an American perspective, the Qatari policy in Syria and its slow response to terror financing were probably most problematic. When the Syrian civil war erupted, Qatar was on the forefront of providing financial aid and weaponry to the Syrian opposition groups of all stripes, with little control or oversight. The Qataris were far from alone in committing this mistake, as a number of other Gulf state actors, as well as Turkey, also pursued an anybody but Assad policy without fully vetting some of these anybodies. Certainly, the United States made its own share of mistakes during this time period, but Qatar and Turkey in particular were the most aggressive in funding some of the more ideologically extremist groups, including al-Qaeda affiliate Jabhat al-Nusra, and we are still living with these mistakes in Syria and will be for years to come. But on some issues, Qatar has been a useful partner. Qatar hosts a critical U.S. air base with more than 10,000 American troops. El Udeid Air Base is a central node from which the United States conducts air operations in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, as well as other operations across the Middle East. The base has hosted U.S. military aircraft for over 15 years, and during that time has been a reliable partner, allowing access for a broad array of military operations. Moreover, Qatar's flexible approach to problematic actors has at times made it a useful connector when diplomacy inevitably requires negotiation and engagement with unsavory characters. Take, for example, Qatar's relationship with Hamas and the aid it provides in Gaza. On the one hand, both the United States and Israel have designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. On the other, Israel has cooperated quietly with Qatar in recent years to ensure financial assistance gets into Gaza in order to try to improve the situation on the ground and avoid another conflict. Whether one chooses to view Qatar positively or negatively, what is clear is that the intra-GCC split that has emerged in recent weeks has not been good for U.S. interests. Only 2 weeks after President Trump visited Riyadh to unify the Arab world behind the common objectives of countering extremism and pushing back on Iran, America's Gulf allies have launched into an internal feud that has largely distracted them and us. Meanwhile, this split has created new opportunities for Russia and Iran to increase their influence in the region. Going forward, the Trump administration should take a number of steps. First, settle on one consistent message and approach instead of open breaks between the President and the Secretary of State, which only cause confusion and undermine our ability to mediate in this crisis. Second, move away from viewing the Middle East through a pure black and white prism. The Trump administration focused so heavily on unifying and backing the Sunni Arab states that it failed to recognize the internal splits among them. This inadvertently gave a green light to some of our Gulf partners to move ahead with these actions against others. Third, settle in for the long haul, as this crisis is not going to be solved anytime soon. We should clearly signal to our partners that we are still focused on the challenges posed by ISIS and Iran, and we expect them to do the same instead of focusing all their diplomatic energy on trying to convince Washington to take their side in this fight. Fourth, encourage de-escalation on all sides by at least getting them all to tone down their public rhetoric while emphasizing that the U.S. is willing to play a constructive mediating role. However, it is ultimately an intra-Arab disagreement that they will need to be out in front in solving. And finally, fifth, I think we should use this crisis as an opportunity to engage with all the countries of the GCC to shine more of a light on the problem of terror financing. As some of the other witnesses and members have said, Qatar certainly is a major problematic actor in this space, but it is far from the only one, and this could actually be an opportunity in terms of this crisis to actually push all of them to be better on this issue. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing, to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Goldenberg, and I thank all of our witnesses for their opening statements. I'd like to open up my line of questioning by recognizing the fact that I think this hearing is very timely. Both Qatar and the Gulf countries have been important partners, and we would like to see a constructive, honest resolution to the crisis. Qatar is a military ally of the United States, but has simultaneously supported Hamas and al-Qaeda. We have a role in easing tensions in the region, but not at the expense of our national security interests and our values. Qatar must cut ties with terrorists. Our allies cannot provide support to our enemies. Dr. Schanzer, I have no sympathy for supporters of Hamas, nor do you. You have called the U.S. base in Qatar an insane arrangement, I think is the quote. Do you believe the base location is dangerous? And how would you propose safely moving the base in such a way that doesn't compromise operations in the region?
Congresswoman Wagner, thank you for the question. Look, I would probably put it this way. First of all, it is an insane arrangement. The idea that you have this forward air base that is conducting the most crucial operations in the war on terrorism, and that it is mere miles away from the Taliban presence, Hamas presence, where there are designated terror financiers from the Nusra Front running around in Doha, this sends the wrong message. It sends the wrong message to the United States and to our allies in the coalition to fight ISIS and al-Qaeda. It sends the wrong message to our Middle East allies as well. In other words, when we tell them that we're going to hold them to account for their terror financing issues, and then they look at what's going on in Qatar, it just doesn't, the optics, I think, are really rather terrible. As for the safety of our troops, so far, I would say so good. We have not had incidents where it appears that our troops are being threatened. I would actually say that's not the case with Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, which is another country that supports some of these terror groups. But at the end of the day, our recommendation has been that we begin to assess what it would take to move the base. Maybe not all of it, maybe not all of it at once, but we need to take a look regionally at the other areas where we may be able to base some of these assets and to signal to the Qataris that we are willing to move. We don't need to do it. We may decide at the end of the day, the Pentagon may decide that they can't afford to do it. It's too difficult. But in the meantime, it's important to message to our to the appropriate people in Qatar that we are willing to look at this problem and to reallocate assets as necessary.
Thank you. Dr. Levitt, can you discuss what actions the Saudis and other Gulf states have taken to combat terror financing that the Qataris have not?
Thank you for the question. You know, terror financing is a problem throughout the Gulf, and it took the Saudis some time to get on top of this problem. For a long time, U.S. Treasury pointed to Saudi Arabia as the epicenter of this problem, but the Saudis turned a corner. There's more that they can do, but the Saudis now run intelligence operations, they prosecute people, they work with us in designating people. There have even been joint U.S.-Saudi designations, including of charities and individuals in Saudi Arabia. That's domestically difficult politically for them, but they've done it. There's more that they can do, but we now tend to point to others within the GCC towards Saudi Arabia, and we're trying to show them what we'd like them, the types of things we'd like them to do more. There is an irony that Kuwait is the country that is kind of playing the middleman on this, and Kuwait is often described as being just as bad as Qatar on terror finance. And that's something we need to recognize as well. But the fact is that there are things that Qatar should have done a long time ago, and that they have not done, and that we have frankly tolerated them not doing, and the overt financing of effectively the most important al-Qaeda entity in the world. Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia is completely beyond the pale.
Thank you. Mr. Goldenberg, in my limited time here, one of the demands from the Gulf states was that Qatar must close down the Turkish military base. I get that they're concerned about the Muslim Brotherhood's influence, but how important do you think this demand is in terms of regional stability and security, and is this one that should be dropped?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. I think that on the list of demands, the Turkish air base is probably lower, or base is lower on the list of demands that the Emiratis and the Saudis and others are leveling. I mean, in most conversations, and what you hear them really focusing on is more has to do with what the countries might be doing in the press and some of the sort of personal attacks at a certain point that the different sides are launching at each other right now. I think that's much more the source of the issue, and the terror financing issue that we've been talking about has been much more central to the debate than this Turkish base that frankly, there had been already a move for the Turks to deploy some forces there a couple years ago. And then when this crisis erupted, they moved everything up and moved it very quickly through as sort of a symbolic step. It's a good example of an opportunity where the crisis and the move has actually backfired on some of our partners. If what they're trying to do is isolate Qatar, what they actually managed to do is strengthen the Turkey-Qatar relationship instead. So I would put this one probably as not as central as some of the other questions that have been out there before, but something that we'll see as time goes on if they walk away from.
Thank you for that insight. My time has elapsed. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Goldenberg, you referred to the flexible approach to problematic actors. And so the question I have for you and for the panel is, what is that? How is it, and here's how it's characterized, right? It's characterized as, well, yes, we know that Hamas is a terrorist organization, but if our ally has a relationship, then perhaps that can help us somehow. Dr. Schanzer, I presume, would argue that Hamas is Hamas and we should have nothing to do with them and our allies shouldn't either. I guess the question is, what does that flexible approach get us? And Dr. Schanzer, if Qatar acted to move all of these terrorist groups out of Qatar, out of Doha altogether, where do they go? And to Mr. Goldenberg's point, is there some benefit to having them there instead of in the arms of ISIS or in Tehran? Mr. Goldenberg, can you help us sort this out?
Sure. Thank you, Ranking Member Deutsch. And exactly, I think this is precisely sort of the point. It's complicated. But what I would say is, or maybe I'll start with an example of Hamas, and I'll actually quote an Israeli former head of research, Yossi Kopelweiser, the former head of research for Israel's military intelligence, who's been up here a lot, I believe, also in the past talking about incitement, saying just a year ago publicly, nobody else is ready to help out but Qatar when it comes to Gaza. So here's a perfect example of the situation that we're dealing with. We've had 3 wars between Israel and Hamas over the last few years in Gaza, with large casualties for Palestinians, for large casualties for the IDF, and the Israelis have started to realize, well, maybe we should not be sort of this approach of just trying to squeeze Hamas in Gaza doesn't seem to be working. And so maybe we need to think about a different approach and trying to at least alleviate the humanitarian situation and find ways to quietly establish channels with these guys so as to keep the situation calm and not have another conflict. Who is the only real channel that they have to do that? The Qataris. And so they've been using that channel, and we've been helping in some cases facilitate that channel. So that's an example. And so if Hamas was instead sitting in Tehran, which is a likely outcome of what would happen if they were kicked out of Doha, then I think what you would see is no ability to actually communicate in that way, and probably Hamas taking more aggressive actions and less ability to squeeze them. So this isn't to justify the Qatari relationship with Hamas. I don't agree with that necessarily. I think it's a problem. It's not something the U.S. should not have any kind of a direct relationship with Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization bent on the destruction of Israel. But we've sort of found that this approach by the Qataris at least has some benefits, and we should at least recognize that as opposed to just vilifying them. Because we'd like them to behave differently, but at the same time they end up, when we ask them to do things that sometimes are in our interest, they're able to push certain levers we are not able to push.
Dr. Schanzer?
Thank you, Congressman Deutsch. I mean, I'm not even sure where to begin. In terms of the potential benefits from Qatar working with Hamas or allowing Hamas to operate out of there, I think it's sort of a counterfactual. We have yet to actually see what the benefits are, other than the fact that the Israelis have allowed the Qataris to provide assistance to Gaza, not to Hamas, but to the people of Gaza for reconstruction. On that, I think the Israelis would agree that it's been a positive. I think we would all agree that it has helped perhaps forestall a major humanitarian disaster, and I think for that we should be thankful. But from there, I do have to question. I mean, it's not like Hamas doesn't have other places where it can operate. It has a base in Turkey, for example. It has its home base in the Gaza Strip. It operates out of the West Bank. It operates out of Sudan, Lebanon. I mean, it has a major presence across the Middle East. Why does it have to operate inside Doha, where they get a certain amount of legitimacy for this? And then perhaps one other thing to note here is that, people talk about how Qatar may have helped perhaps bring the conflict to an end in 2014. If you speak to the other actors in the region, they will tell you, whether it's the Egyptians or the Israelis or even others, they will tell you that it was actually the Qataris and the Turks that forestalled an end to the conflict, that they continued to negotiate on behalf of Hamas. And I think that they probably, in doing so, probably led to the loss of many, many more lives.
Unfortunately, I'm out of time. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman, time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cook, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My opening remarks, I talked about this news story about the North Koreans working on the World Cup, and the figures that I read were about 3,000. And in the article, it talked about the possibility of whether they could be militarized. And this is a scenario that is kind of scary. We talked about the fact we have our largest military base right there, which is, as you said, insane. Or can you just comment on that possibility, well, where this is another dimension and another threat to this? Because every week it seems we have to reevaluate which is the #1 enemy. So, Dr. Levitt, could you start?
So I haven't seen this report, so I don't want to comment on a report I haven't seen, other than to say the North Korea issue is a very important and pressing issue, and in some ways it's much more important than this one, to be sure. But in general, I think we need to learn ways to be able to leverage conversation and, if necessary, pressure on Qatar on a wide array of issues that we have with them, and this would be one more. And you have to do that in a way that is flexible, because we have many very positive relationships with Qatar. I would argue that the way to be flexible, though, is not to say it's perfectly okay to have X number of North Koreans in the country working in ways that we don't know, or to host anybody you want from Hamas. Certainly, for example, I'd make a difference between hosting certain leaders of Hamas who are sitting in a hotel room as opposed to people like Salah al-Aruri, who is now believed to be in Lebanon, but was sitting comfortably in Qatar for quite some time, where he was literally plotting attacks against Israeli civilians. That should be completely beyond the pale. And again, I haven't seen this report, but this would be another thing that we'd have to figure out. How do you have multiple conversations with a country at the same time? On some issues, you have agreement. On some issues, you have great disagreement. I think we have done that very poorly across administrations.
Okay. Any others want to comment on this? Doctor?
I'll comment for a moment, sir. I think it's important to talk about, when you talk about foreign workers in Qatar, The 3,000 that you mentioned are actually, it's a very small number, relatively speaking, in relation to the 800,000 plus foreign workers that are active right now in Qatar. I've seen the reports of the North Korean workers there. The concern actually was not that they would be potentially operational, but rather that they were effectively slave labor
Yes,
was
exactly.
given to the Qataris, and that whatever they were being paid was being remitted back to North Korea, and that this was an inadvertent way or a backdoor way of financing North Korea. So these are the concerns that we have. I believe that the Qataris have addressed this problem, last I heard, but I've not seen a lot of updates on this.
The reason I asked that question, because we're having the debate and everything else about the sanctions against North Korea, and this might be another variable that would be included in this. Any comments on what happened last year? I was over in that area, and the State Department was, quite frankly, at that time, this was about a year ago, maybe a year and a half, and they were arguing on behalf of Qatar for the upgrade for the F-15s. They thought it was be in the best interest, and I was kind of shocked at that in terms of foreign military sales. And do you have any comment on that? I almost, when I was there, viewed it as almost the Middle East Stockholm Syndrome, because they were very, very supportive of Qatar with all its problems, and it kind of shocked me, at least from a military standpoint. Doctor, either one?
Sure. Actually, I served in the Pentagon for a few years on Middle East issues, so I can maybe talk a little bit about this. From my perspective, look, I mean, this is a problem we have with all the Gulf states. On the one hand, you know, their arms sales are very useful to our industry.
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm talking about the F-15 upgrade. This is a significant leap, and I understand your expertise in the Pentagon. I've spent a few years in the military myself, although I certainly cannot fly an airplane. But in regards to that particular weapon system, which is kind of more sophisticated than some of the others.
Well, sir, I was just going to say that my issue with, I can't tell you about that specific weapon system and that specific upgrade. I can tell you that generally I think we have an issue where we probably sell these countries too much weaponry because they have the money, and what they really need is sort of lower-end technology to deal with counterterrorism problems and things like that, which are much more important, I think, for their interests than ours.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman, time expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On June 9th, our Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, stated, "We call on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt to ease the blockade on Qatar." Later that same exact day, Donald Trump referred to the decision to initiate the blockade as hard but necessary. And then, as you know, a few days later, the United States sells $12 billion worth of fighter jets to Qatar. So my question is to the panel, what is your understanding of the current U.S. position on this so-called blockade? Do we support it? Do we oppose it? What is the answer to that?
Sure. Well, I'll start, I guess, and think others also have comments. I mean, from my perspective, I think we have a disagreement inside the administration, and for the most part have seen this disagreement, so I'm not 100% sure. I do think that what it does do, it causes some confusion, because you can't really, Secretary Tillerson is clearly trying to act as a mediator, and he's going out there and trying to do that. He had a trip just last week, or a couple weeks back, to do that. And meanwhile, you have some of these other comments coming from elsewhere. So the Qataris will then go to the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, who seem to have positions more in line with their own, and the Emiratis and the Saudis and others will go to the White House, who seems to have positions more in line with their own. And that's really not an effective way to sort of try to conduct and mediate this conflict. I think it's causing some problems. So I would say it's ambiguous right now what the policy is.
So let me ask you another question. There have been various media reports that the Trump organization has lots of businesses in Saudi Arabia and some of these other countries, but not Qatar. Do you think that plays any role, or could it?
Honestly, Congressman, I don't know. I don't know their motivation, what's behind it.
That's fine. I'll ask you another question. There have been various reports that Jared Kushner basically got stiffed by some folks in Qatar. You think this could play any role in that?
Certainly a possibility, but it's not something that I would, again, have any knowledge of.
Thank you. Let me move on to a question I had mentioned in my opening statement. Are there families being separated because of this so-called blockade based on their national origin? Or any panel member?
I mean, my understanding is at least that, yes, there are issues where the Qataris and you have a lot of people who are moving between the Qataris, the Emirati, in the various GCC states, and so you are going to end up in situations where, all GCC or all, I believe, Qatari nationals had 2 weeks to get out of certain GCC states.
And so you would be separating husband and wives from each other if they happen to be of different national origin, correct?
That's what I've seen in the press. Beyond that, and I've heard concerns about that, but I can't really speak for their policy, obviously.
Okay. I have met with various representatives from these Gulf state countries, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar. One of the things that the representatives from Qatar said is, with respect to the Taliban, they said it's true there is a Taliban office in Qatar, but that the U.S. asked them to open it. Is that true? Anyone on the panel?
I'll maybe take a first stab at that one. As I understand it, there was a Taliban presence that was already there in Doha, that there were representatives of the Taliban who had come there before the opening of this office. Then came the initiative by the Obama administration to negotiate with the Taliban, an attempt to find pragmatic members of the group. And so they essentially authorized what became the Taliban embassy. As I mentioned in my testimony, this was something that was very frustrating to those within the Afghan government who were struggling for their own recognition of legitimacy. They felt that this undermined them, and I've heard this from a number of U.S. officials on both sides of the aisle. What happened after that was the trade for Bo Bergdahl, the American serviceman who had gone missing in Afghanistan, and he was traded for the Taliban 5. This was facilitated by the Qataris and the Taliban 5. These are high-ranking Taliban officials and operatives ultimately came to Qatar as well, and so they augmented the presence that had already been there. And since that time, the concern has been not just that there has been an official presence of the Taliban inside Doha, but rather that also Taliban officials, Taliban militants have come in and they have reconnected with the Taliban 5 and some of the others. So there's concern that it's not just that presence that was first blessed by the Obama administration, but that there have been some operational concerns as well.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Does Qatar, this question for anyone who's able to answer, does Qatar view Hamas as a terrorist organization? Or I could maybe a multiple choice. Or does Qatar view Hamas as a legitimate resistance? Or would you give it some other characterization? How does the government of Qatar view Hamas?
Maybe I'll start. The government of Qatar does not see Hamas as a terrorist organization. It sees the violence that Hamas carries out as being legitimate, and it continues to insist that overall that the critique that has been leveled at the Qataris over the last several weeks as this crisis has unfolded, they continue to say that they do not agree with the definition of terrorism that their critics are using. Again, I see this as a very poor defense. They know exactly how we view the problem, and they are allies of the United States. They are hosting our air base. They know the difference between right and wrong, at least in the way that the West views it, and they refuse to recognize it, and that's one of the problems that we have. And I think that maybe just a postscript that if this is the case with Hamas, who else might they view differently? How do they view the Taliban, where we just talked about a base that's there? How do they view the Nusra Front? Do they see them as terrorists? Probably not. And so what we see is a growing list of actors where we would disagree on whether they are legitimate, illegitimate, terrorist, not terrorist.
Does anyone disagree with that? What options do we have, if at all, to get Qatar to change their view of Hamas as a legitimate resistance?
Look, in the first instance, there are already reports that Qatar has asked at least 6 Hamas members to leave the country. That's good. That means some pressure works. So long as there's no consequence, this is a no-brainer for Qatar. Qatar is a small but rich country, and if it wants to box out of its weight class, it can either spend money or do other things that make it more of a player. It has been able to make itself more of a player in part by reaching out to Islamist groups that are beyond the pale for most, and therefore being a key intermediary. We collectively, especially coming right after the European Court of Justice's ruling just now upholding the EU's designation of all of Hamas, not some wings and others, but all of it, we in the West collectively need to make it clear to Qatar that hosting and providing services to a group that is committed to the destruction of a UN member state and to civilians is unacceptable. And I put that in a different basket from Qatar's support to citizens in Gaza, which the Israelis fully support. In fact, it's done through Israel. That's a different issue. If Qatar wants to be a responsible player in that regard, fine. But hosting and providing safe haven to the leaders of a US and EU designated terrorist group is a problem.
Has Qatar weighed in, to the best of your knowledge, with regards to the U.S. moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? Are you aware of the nature of Qatar helping in the mission to defeat ISIS?
Well, I think that yes, and that Qatar hosts, our forces at El Udeid Air Base, which is where we have the KAOC, which is the central coordinating function that then allows basically is responsible for coordinating all of our operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, especially Iraq and Syria, where ISIS is primarily based, is a central element of our strategy. And, I just would disagree.
I really should have clarified. I mean, other than the obvious that, we have a base there, but the nature of these relationships with other terrorist organizations, and they're very welcoming to just about everyone, it seems, in the region. So outside of the obvious, what can we add? What could you add as far as Qatar's other efforts? Not supporting, not allowing us to operate there, but what else are they doing?
Not entirely sure I understand the question, but Qatar is a member of the counter-ISIS coalition. Its commitment has been somewhat limited. It's flown some missions, but it's refused to drop bombs, so it's flown behind other airplanes in case something happens to them. That's not nothing, but it's not as much as others. I think the biggest issue is that now across administrations of different political persuasions, we have been more interested in getting another number to add to the number of coalition members, adding Qatar, without insisting that to be a part of it, you also have to meet certain thresholds. And it seems crazy to me they should be able to be part of the counter-ISIL coalition while still supporting other equally dangerous radical Islamist groups like Al-Qaeda in Syria.
I would love to get into that further, but I noticed that I am out of time, so I have to yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm wondering if you can address the double standard that exists and that we're confronted with all of this attention being focused on Qatar, with different members of the administration very strongly calling out Qatar for its support of terrorism, yet almost in the same breath, embracing Saudi Arabia and lauding their counterterrorism efforts, when I think some of you have mentioned in your opening comments Saudi Arabia's long history of supporting terrorism and exporting the Wahhabi Salafist ideology around the world that really creates these fertile recruiting grounds for terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. What to speak of Saudi Arabia, Turkey's support of different terrorist groups in places like Syria, Saudi support for al-Qaeda in Yemen, in their fight in Yemen. So all of this attention is focused on Qatar with very little, if no passing mention of Saudi Arabia's role in all of this.
I want to make sure my colleague Matt Levitt gets a moment to speak, but maybe just a couple of quick thoughts. Number one, you mentioned Turkey. I think that probably a whole other hearing should be done on Turkey, that the same sorts of behaviors that we're seeing exhibited by the Qataris, we have seen with the Turks, and we have seen them in very similar ways. In fact, I think it was just yesterday, I don't know if he's still there, but the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, was in Doha, and they are strategic partners. And I think we need to address this. And I think I mentioned before that the Incirlik Air Base, we have very similar issues with Incirlik that we do with Al Udeid. I see them really as mirror images of one another. The Turks host a Hamas base. They have been known to open up their borders to allow for Nusra fighters to go back and forth, possibly ISIS fighters as well. So there are a lot of problems with the Turks that I think probably deserves some attention.
I agree.
Then I think the other thing that both Matt and I have mentioned today is the problem of Kuwait. The fact that Kuwait has become a mediator in this is somewhat ridiculous, that the Kuwaitis have been identified time and again by our former colleagues at the Treasury Department and current, that Kuwait is a huge problem when it comes to terror finance, probably rivaling that of Qatar, and so that should be addressed. As for Saudi Arabia, I would agree with the assessment that it has turned a corner. It is not, it's not out of the woods, but it has gotten a lot better. It's not best in breed. I think that probably, that distinction probably goes to the Emirates right now in the Gulf states, but they still have their problems too. What I started to say at the beginning of my testimony and prepared remarks is that all of these, the entire Gulf is a problematic region. I think the Saudis were seen as the #1 producer of radicalism and radical ideology. I think it's been eclipsed. And as they're trying, it looks as though right now they're looking to get better at this, and they still have problems with teaching radicalism and spreading radicalism. But as they improve, we're seeing some of these other countries double down, and Qatar, I think, has really been the most prominent among them.
Well, I think, and we've got about a minute and a half if others want to comment, but the issue with Saudi Arabia, we've heard that, yes, they're making progress, and yes, there's change occurring, but I and others have asked this administration for very specific examples, data, benchmarks, changes, and to date, we have not gotten any kind of specifics, either in writing or in person. And frankly, what we've gotten is a lot of lip service. So, you know, the question of how long this has been going on with Saudi Arabia casts a huge amount of doubt on saying, yeah, okay, well, we think they're improving in this.
I'll just add that Qatar in the here and now, right now, is doing things that have to stop. There's no question that the Saudis for a very long time did a whole lot of things that not only caused problems then, but are still causing problems now, and I'm not going to make excuses for them. They have turned corners, and I can't explain why the administration wouldn't provide some information about that, which is not to say that there's not a lot more that they could do. But as several members of the committee have said, several of you have been approached by different members of GCC states recently, so have those of us in think tanks. And I've mentioned to some of my Saudi and Emirati colleagues in particular, beware pushing too hard on general ideas of extremism, because it's not like you haven't had problems of your own. Beware of pushing too hard on the issue of the Taliban in Qatar, UAE, because for a period of time, Taliban officials were strolling into Dubai with suitcases of cash, and so long as that was invested in real estate, no one cared. Right? So the UAE and the Saudis, despite what they have done in the past, have turned corners. We need Qatar to do the same. We shouldn't expect that Qatar will suddenly be perfect in the same way that its neighbors are not yet perfect. But we cannot tolerate some of the most egregious behavior that they've done, even as I said in written and oral testimony, some of the charges that have been arrayed against them are simply untrue. But some of them are very true.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you for taking the time to come here and sit with us today. I want to get to something very quickly. You know, we've been discussing the support of terror from different actors. Terrorism, I've heard it said before, terrorism isn't an enemy. Terrorism is a tactic that is used by an enemy. So to that end, I'd like to hear from each one of you. What is it that you think is trying to be achieved by the tactic of supporting that tactic, by supporting terror? What is the end that each one of you sees being played out?
So as I answered to another question, I think Qatar is trying to make itself a bigger player on the world stage than it would otherwise be by being a small peninsula, almost an island, of a very small population. The vast majority of people on the island are foreign workers. But it happens to be very, very wealthy, the wealthiest nation on planet Earth per capita. And it has also found another way to kind of punch beyond its weight, and that is through making relationships with other Islamist groups that it has been able to use to its own benefit, and sometimes being able to reach out to others and say, hey, I can be a middleman for you too. That has proved to be very, very dangerous. And so Qatar has never had a situation where there was a cost to having the kind of relationship it wants and needs with us, which we'd like to have with them too, at the same time that they are having very close relationships with some of the worst of the worst.
Mr. Schanzer, Mr. Goldenberg?
I agree with Matt. I think that overall Qatar realizes that it's extremely vulnerable, that it's tiny, and that it doesn't have the means to push back on some of its very tough neighbors. It shares natural gas wealth with the Iranians, and they have to figure out how to get along. And so having some of these proxies available to them is a useful thing. By the way, so is having an American air base where they can sort of bare their teeth at the Iranians. But at the end of the day, what they're trying to do, what's happened over time, is they've become very wealthy, and they have tried to use whatever means they have to purchase power. And so you see them buying up large chunks of London, large chunks of Washington. You see them paying for proxies across the Middle East, trying to push the Muslim Brotherhood into positions of power so that they too would be able to ride the waves of power. This is a lot of what drives them right now. I think they've taken this way too far.
And just to add, and I agree with a lot of what Jonathan and Matt have said, Qatar has also just traditionally pursued sort of a third-way foreign policy in the Gulf. You know, a lot of the smaller Gulf states choose to align themselves with Saudi Arabia. Qatar, basically since 1995, when there was a turnover and a sort of a palace coup, the emir took over, the father of the current emir, chose a different approach, which involved not just going along with the Saudis. And if you're a very small country with a much bigger one sitting right next to you who's sort of running a lot of the region, if you're going to go with that contrary policy, you try to find every division that you can and every opportunity that you can to influence. And so it builds relationships oftentimes with other actors. I think this also is part of the reason they have a slightly different approach to Iran, which is probably a little more accommodationist, although I think that also has a lot to do with sharing the gas field, as Jonathan said. So, you know, I think this is, it's partially, it's about increasing their influence, but it's also about increasing their influence and being independent of Saudi Arabia within the context of the GCC.
Okay, so you've each mentioned what you thought to the end was, and we are talking about terrorism, support of terror. We're talking about a very kinetic action. We're not talking about something cyber. We're not talking about something economic. We're talking about a very kinetic action. So in that, being that Qatar has been purchasing foreign military or our military equipment to the tune of $10 billion in 14, $17 billion in 15. What is the jump that you make connecting the dots to that end? Do you make a jump there? Do you fear moving from the tactic of terror to a conventional tactic? Is that the assessment that you make?
No. They're still a small country. They don't want to get into a fight with anybody. I think in their mind also, this is not a kinetic. They're just supporting groups, and they make a distinction in their own mind, this kind of cognitive dissonance between other things they might be doing. They're supporting the political office of Hamas in their mind. They're supporting Islamists who are effective in fighting Assad and nothing else in their mind. It's not quite so simple, but that's how they think of it. I don't think this is at all a threat of regular military-to-military conflict.
I would just add, when you look at Qatar, we've been having this conversation for the last hour plus. I think it's important to note that Qatar is a country of roughly 300,000 people. It's tiny. It has more foreign workers in the country than actual nationals. They are incredibly vulnerable. They're not picking a fight directly with anyone, and this is why they've chosen that soft power approach. They bring the conflict away from them. They cause problems for other people that only they can solve. This is the Qatari way.
My time has expired. I thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mast. And God has granted me another opportunity to make good on the pronunciation of Mr. Swazi's name. So I am pleased to yield time to Mr. Swazi of New York.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm going to pick up on something you just said about 300,000 people that live in Qatar. And I'm going to change my line of questioning based upon that. There are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. And the challenge that we face in today's world is most Muslims don't participate in this awful, horrific activity of terrorism and trying to promote terrorism and extremism and violence. And the challenge is, who's winning in this battle to try and promote extremism and violence? And, there are 750,000 Muslims that live in Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. The other 750, what did I say? 750 million, did I say that? And another 750 million who live outside of those countries. So the question is, things are dynamic. Congresswoman Gabbard was talking about how, Saudi Arabia's activities over decades and promoting Wahhabism and building madrasas and promoting extremism all over the world. But things are dynamic and things are changing. And some people are moving closer to our way of thinking, not to promote violence and extremism. And some people are moving further away and continuing to promote violence and extremism. So where would you place Qatar on where they are right now?
It's a great question, and I would say they've got one foot in one camp and one foot in the other. And this is really what's maddening about Qatar, right? I mean, so on the one hand, they are hosting our forward air base, and they are a vital partner in the war on terrorism. And they are investing through their sovereign wealth. They're investing here in the U.S. and across the West. They're investing in legitimate investments, and they've provided a crucial service in terms of providing hard capital, especially when things got rough about a decade ago. They were there and they were helping. The problem is they've used that as leverage so that when we come to them and we talk to them about their support for the various groups that we've mentioned, the jihadists in Syria, the jihadists in Libya, the Taliban, and Hamas, and we go to them, we talk to them about this, they just don't listen.
So if the people from Qatar wanted to clearly demonstrate to us that they are moving away from promoting any kind of extremism and they're moving closer to our way of thinking, than the West way of thinking, what would be the 2 or 3 things that they would have to do to demonstrate that in a clear way?
Look, for my money, expel. We should be providing with a list of people that they should expel, and it should be people who are part of the Taliban, part of Hamas, part of these various Syrian jihadi groups. Let me put it this way. I've heard from diplomats in Doha that, the Qataris can't do that because it would really upset the Qatari population, that it would really be very unpopular. We're talking about 300,000 people who live in an absolute monarchy. If the emir wants them gone, they will be gone. It is that simple, and we can ask.
Okay, I've only got a minute and 55 seconds left, so Dr. Levitt.
We're not talking about 300,000 people when we're talking about the problems in Qatar. We're talking about a much, much, much smaller number. In fact, when it comes to the al-Qaeda financiers, we're talking about probably 2 to 3 dozen people max that we're truly concerned about. And we're talking about a small number of people in government who need to act. So this is actually one of the reasons it's so frustrating is it's so doable. This is an absolute monarchy. They have a respectable security service. They have no tolerance for this type of activity targeting them within the kingdom. But so long as activity that's happening within the kingdom is targeting others, they're okay if it gives them some type of leverage. We need to make clear that there's more leverage to be had in having a wholesome relationship with us, with the Europeans, with the West, and that there are consequences in terms of that relationship if they don't. This is fixable.
If I can just add one point, Congressman, I think this crisis actually gives us an opportunity to build some leverage and go to all of these countries, to go to the Qataris and say, okay, here's our list. You really want our support in this crisis? Like, we need you to see your action on this. And also to go again to the Saudis and the Emiratis and also them. It's
I
the
agree
exact
with
same
that.
thing. And so I think there's this real opportunity now, you know, sort of the silver lining of this crisis of having our partners all at each other's throats instead of focusing on what we'd want to see them focus on, because I'd rather see them more focused on Iran. I'd rather see them focus on a counter-ISIS fight, not on spending their time in Washington trying to get all of us, you know, on their side. But here's an opportunity. Let's turn it on them and say, let's see all of you live up. Here's the standard we want to go by, and we want all the countries of the Gulf to go by this standard. And here's what we expect from you.
Yes, please, go
I
right
realize
ahead.
we're over, but along these lines, there's a mechanism to do that. At the Riyadh summit, we created something called the Terror Finance Tracking Center. There's no meat on those bones yet, right? No one knows what, including the Secretary of the Treasury who just testified about it, no one really knows what that's going to be yet, but it's a potential structure. We could put some meat on those bones. That's a GCC-wide effort, and we should be acting and demanding for participation from all the GCC countries, because these are problems that are happening within all of them, even if Qatar and Kuwait are the biggest problems right now.
So thank you, Madam Chair. You know, there's a real battle in the world going on between stability and instability, and it's not necessarily ideology. It's criminals that are participating in murder and extortion and kidnapping and drug dealing and trying to promote extremism ideology. And it's not a group, it's individuals, as you're pointing out, that we need to target. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And now we turn to Mr. Issa of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just for the record briefly, Mr. Chancellor, last time you were in the administration?
10 years ago.
10 years ago, Bush, right? To Leavitt, last time?
Bush.
Mr. Goldenberg, State Department, when?
2014.
Okay, till very recently, all facts considered. So all of you have been in a position that this committee oversees. We actually don't oversee Qatar. We don't oversee Kuwait. We oversee the places you were. So I'm going to tell you a story. It's a Bush-era story. 16 years ago, there was a hearing in this room, and we were evaluating the incredibly unreasonable activities of Kazakhstan, because they had the audacity to want to sell their MiG-21s to a hostile nation. The other side of the story was they had come to the State Department, they'd come to our government in the Bush administration, and they'd said, look, we're a poor country, we're trying to become a rich country, we've got oil, we want to turn these weapons into plowshares. We want to actually sell them off, we're not replacing them, we simply want to raise some cash. And they said, who can we sell them to? To Goldenberg, oddly enough, State said, we can't give you a list. Clearly, Lockheed wasn't interested in buying them unless they were trade-ins. Neither was Boeing, or others. So my question to you is, each of you, because I've been through these hearings on country after country, and we are going to see whether it's the Palestinian Authority and including Hamas, whether it's Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. We're going to keep having these hearings, and we're always going to find one thing. Money is leaking to bad people from within these countries, either by individuals or, in fact, there may be a nexus to the government in some way. Yeah. What I want to know is, what are each of you prepared to do, and should this administration do under our auspices, and I think, Mr. Chancellor, you alluded to this, to make list of who you can give to make list of who you want out, to make list. In other words, how do we get the administration to set solid, predictable standards so we know it's not a mixed message? Please.
Thank you, Congressman. What I would say is, A, I think we can provide lists and say these people shouldn't be here or they should be in jail, and that you need to take action. And I think that's a very, straightforward approach. There are other things that I mentioned.
And I will commit that if you provide that list, I will forward, and I hope my chairperson will actually do it on my behalf, but I will commit to forward it to the administration, asking them, have they and will they make that request?
We'll take you up on that. What I would also add, though, is that there are other ways of putting pressure on countries like Qatar that don't involve the individuals themselves, but that make it more painful. So I mentioned the STORM Act, which was introduced in the Senate and is yet to be introduced in the House, but this would potentially label Qatar and/or any other country a jurisdiction of terrorism finance concern, which would then have a chilling effect on those who would be, interested in doing commerce.
But my question was more narrow, is how do we get, like those lists, specific to the administration? One of the challenges we have, we pass these various acts, and then there gets to be all kinds of debate about it. But what I think I've heard throughout the day, both here and when I was in the back, is that there are specific asks that we should be asking countries to do, including, in this case, Qatar. Now, there are things they can't undo. The emir visiting Hamas and giving money for a hospital, we can't unring any of that. We can only feel that it was not helpful, to say the least. So one of my questions to each of you with the limited time is, can you briefly tell us additional acts, and can you agree to give us lists of things that you believe we should work with the administration to get done? My hope is that it will not be pass a law that ties this and future administrations' hands, but rather things you know should be done that we need to ask them, why aren't they doing it?
So to be perfectly blunt, sir.
I love blunt.
I know you do. They know because we've told them. I'm happy, I'll speak for all three of us. We're happy to provide you information. We have a Treasury attaché in Doha. He works real hard all the time. This new MOU is going to send a Department of Justice OPDAT official, prosecutor, to help them with their prosecutions. There is no question about the names, not only because we've designated many, because we have this very open conversation with them many times. In one of my recent conversations with a senior Qatari official, the official said to me, look, Matt, you're former FBI. We need the FBI to tell us. I said, no, sir. You have a really good security service. I know because I've worked with you in the past. I know that our people are working with you on a regular basis. You know that I know that you know exactly who we're talking about. And therefore, it's frustrating, as I mentioned earlier, when a senior Qatari official says just yesterday, all of the terror financier subjects in our country have been subject to prosecution. That's not true, nor is prosecution the only tool in the tool chest. So I'd argue that the problem here is not the lists. The problem here is that they've refused to do it, and we haven't had any type of consequence for that because we need them for other things, we want them for other things, but we have to be able to balance that.
Well, that's why I believe our list forwarded will have more of a why not. And I want you to answer, but my question was broader. It wasn't just Qatar. It's very clear that we have similar requests from other allies or semi-allies throughout the Gulf. Yes.
Thank you, Congressman. Just one quick point. I know we're over time, but I think one thing the committee could do is, for example, ask for a report on what it would mean to actually diversify away from the Qatari air base. Not because I necessarily recommend doing that. I actually think it'd end up being very expensive and difficult, and if we can, we should keep that base as a valuable asset. But I also don't think it's a point of leverage to the point that we just mindlessly say, well, we're just going to keep doing this because we're doing it right now, and it keeps a gun to our head. And I think unless you sort of push the Pentagon or the State Department to at least start creatively thinking about alternatives, the answer you will always get from any administration is, we have zero leverage here, we need this base, which isn't actually the case. So that would be another area which would also, I think, send an interesting signal.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. And now we turn to Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for your testimony. Dr. Levitt, I want to just start with you. You served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and so you understand the critical role that our agencies play in advancing and implementing U.S. foreign policy. And as I'm hearing your testimony, it just reminds me how disturbing it is and how much more complicated it is that this administration has not only called for a 30% cut in funding to the State Department, but has left really important positions vacant and without nominees. At a moment that we're trying to manage this crisis and this very serious conflict in the Middle East, we're still awaiting nominees for the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs and USAID Assistant Administrator for the Middle East. And at a time when terror groups continue to talk about efforts to pursue weapons of mass destruction, it's really baffling to me that we would leave vacant the position of Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. I take it you all are equally mystified by that.
It would be much better if we had these positions filled.
Great, thank you. I want to first talk about Turkey. One of the demands on Qatar has been to close the Turkish military base located in Qatar. And Turkey has responded, of course, by bolstering its military presence as a strong show of support. And my question really is this a real demand? What's the purpose of it? And what would be the implications if this base closed?
I'll let Alon speak in a sec, but what I would just say is you have to understand, we talk about the politics of this region, and overall, these countries are upset with Qatar for its financing of Muslim Brotherhood groups across the Arab world. And they see it as a challenge to their view of the region, which they would like to maintain something of the status quo. The Turks have been strategic partners with the Qataris. There is no question about it. And so they see this as a doubling down on that sort of Muslim Brotherhood axis, if you will. And so they see it as a threat. I think that, I don't think they want to open up another front on this. I think they're focusing on Qatar for a reason, but when you speak to these, to representatives of these countries, they will tell you that they see the Turks as perhaps a second in line in terms of the challenge to the regional order that they seek.
And is it your assessment that this has pushed Qatar closer to Turkey, this blockade?
Oh, they didn't need to be any closer. They were already strategic partners. But now I think, I mean, as I see it right now, Qatar has very few friends, so they've reached out to the Turks and they've drawn closer to the Turks. And alarmingly, they also appear to have drawn closer to the Iranians, which is one of the things that Qatar's adversaries were warning about in the first place.
Congressman, if I can add one point on Turkey, there was this initial list of 13 demands by the countries that implemented the blockade. That list has since been narrowed down to 6 and was last week in a statement that they put out, and the Turkish base is no longer on that list of demands. And so I think that the Turkey issue is an issue for them precisely for the reasons that Jonathan talked about. But it's, I think, a lesser priority for them than some of the issues in counterterror financing, their concerns about whether Qatar is meddling in their own internal affairs, which they consistently talk about, Al Jazeera, things like that are, I think, really what they care a lot more about than the Turkey issue. And on Iran, I would only add, I think it's true that, yeah, Qatar has a more accommodationist approach than some of the other Gulf states, but I also think there's a real mix across the Gulf on Iran that's important to recognize. The GCC, if anything, we've learned from this crisis, the GCC is not homogeneous. The Saudis take the hardest line on Iran. Even within the UAE, Abu Dhabi takes a hard line. Dubai, much less so in terms of trade. So, I do think there's this diversity of views. Oman obviously played a very different role on Iran, more as a mediator, especially during the nuclear talks.
But I'd like to follow up with both of you on Iran. The Qataris have obviously been trying to counter Iran strategically, but at the same time kind of continue to maintain a dialogue with their Iranian counterparts. What do you think is the rationale for that decision and the kind of long-term implications?
So I think they're a country of 300,000 people, as we've talked about, and all of their wealth, majority of their wealth, comes from this huge gas field that they share with the Iranians. They own half of it, the Iranians have the other half. And so this is a reality of geopolitics that they're living with, and you're never going to get them to, I think, pull away completely. At the same time, at least my engagement with Qatari government officials, you don't hear a lot of love for the Iranians necessarily. You do hear some angst, but they're not going to take a hardline approach like the Saudis. I just don't think that they can afford to, given the position that they're in.
I would agree with that. I think a lot of this is driven by the Qatari need for survival. But I've heard from some of our friends in the region in recent months a concern that the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran are not exactly at odds with one another. I think we have this sort of preconceived notion that because the Muslim Brotherhood is a Sunni organization, a Sunni network, it is fundamentally at odds with Iran. That has not been the case historically. Looking just at Hamas, for example, you have this confluence of both Qatari support and Iranian support there. So there may be more than meets the eye, and this is, I think, something that is worthy of perhaps additional research.
Thank you so much. I yield back, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, and appreciated your insights that you provided us today. I've got a long history in dealing with Qatar and with those other countries. I've been here 30 years now, and I worked with the White House before I got here. And what I can't help but lament that things seem to be going in the opposite direction than what we had as a positive potential 20 and 30 years ago. It really did look like Qatar and some other countries in that region were going to go in a more positive direction. And now what we see is basically either schizophrenia on their part, trying to play both sides against all sides, or these people think that they can just juggle. They think they're the world's greatest jugglers and that they can handle both groups of enemies and friends. So let me ask this. When you talk to the people from Qatar, and I have, and they will tell you every time that they, and again, there was one question earlier on this, that they were asked to bring in the Taliban, that they were asked to bring in Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and these various groups by the United States government. Even during the last administration, did we indeed ask them to bring in the Taliban and have a greater opportunity for the Taliban to use their area there in Qatar as a base of dealing with the world?
Sure. So I didn't work, it wasn't the last administration, but I did not work on issues having to do with the Taliban. Or
Okay, can anyone answer that question? They're telling us we asked them to do it. Did we ask them to do it?
But I do think, I can answer from my understanding, which is, I do think we asked them to do it, but I do think it also goes back to this point that part of the reason we asked them to do it is because the Taliban were already operating there in some form or capacity already. So
okay, so there's some verification that perhaps the United States government did ask them to get involved with some of these what we consider to be terrorist elements. We know that the deal for the Taliban 5 terrorist leaders, were traded for one traitor for our government, which I thought was the worst raw deal that we could ever have possibly gotten. That was something our administration did, and it would happen via Qatar. Now, let me just ask this, and I'm going to be very pointed here. And look, the Clinton Foundation has received millions of dollars of contributions, we know, from Russian oligarchs. Is there any, how much has the Clinton Foundation received from Qatar? Do we know of any, or maybe Qatar has not given any money to the foundation, is that right?
None of us have those figures, but I just want to correct one thing. There's some debate as to what the United States might have asked Qatar to do or not regarding the Taliban, and I think it's now clear. They asked Qatar to allow this office to be open since the Taliban was already there.
All right.
So this was not Hamas.
Okay,
You had mentioned
I've
this was not Hezbollah.
I got 1 minute left.
This was not Al-Qaeda.
I'm sorry, I've got 1 minute left on this, and let me just note, Madam Chairman, I think it will.
You have more time. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Well, I think it would be fitting, Madam Chairman, that we make a request to find out if Qatar has been the source of major donations to the Clinton Foundation, and if indeed our government, during the time when Hillary Clinton was our Secretary of State, did indeed ask Qatar to permit some of these what we consider terrorist organizations into their country. This needs to be looked at very closely, because we know that the Clinton Foundation was certainly in Russia receiving tens of millions of dollars from Russian oligarchs. Let's just note that whether it's Al-Qaeda or the Muslim Brotherhood, these jihadists and Hezbollah, Qatar has to make its choice. And by the way, just one point that was made here earlier, I do not consider the rebuilding of Gaza to be a positive act. That if indeed the Palestinians are shooting rockets into Israel and Israel retaliates, for Qatar just to step forward and to rebuild everything that's been destroyed by Israeli retaliation, what we are really doing is encouraging the people in Gaza to permit the shooting of rockets from their territory into Israel. No, people, the fact is that if indeed Israel is retaliating against an attack, we should not be cleaning up the mess. Those people who actually permitted the attacks in the first place should be paying a price for it. Because we don't want attacks. We want there to be peace. This is the two-state solution was supposed to come out of this. And instead, the Palestinians ever since have just been shooting rockets and creating terrorist attacks against Israel. No, let's discourage that by not rebuilding their buildings if they have been destroyed as a retaliation against this type of terrorist attack on Israel. Let me just say again, and I agree with this, that this has not been a hearing about all the rest of these states. Frankly, I don't find Qatar any worse than our Saudi friends. And there is, again, schizophrenia going on there. But we look at the Muslim Brotherhood and the impact that it is having throughout that region, and we realize that both in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia, they embraced the Muslim Brotherhood philosophy, which has served as basically the intellectual foundation for these terrorists, wherever they are, whatever they call them, Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah or jihadist or Taliban or whatever we want to call them, ISIL. We need to make sure that it's a time of choosing right now. The juggling has got to stop. And I would hope that the royal family in Qatar and the people of Qatar decide to be our friends, because they have that choice. But if they continue down this path, they will be deciding not to be our friends and decide instead with the Muslim Brotherhood and the terrorists. So I hope that this hearing today sends that message.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. And Mr. Schneider is recognized for the same amount of time.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I will apologize in advance. I have a concurrent markup in judiciary. If I jump up and leave, it's because I have to go vote. Please don't take it personally. But thank you for your time here, for sharing your perspectives, but also for the work you do on this and other important issues. There's so much here and so much to understand. I think my colleagues have touched on some of the intuitive and counterintuitive aspects of our relationship with Qatar and the difficulties in fully defining the parameters. I'll ask a leading question. Would it be better for us in the region if Hamas, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda weren't raising finances in Doha?
Yes, it would be better.
Dr. Schanzer?
Yes, it would, and it would also be better if they didn't have a presence there that was legitimized.
Mr.
Yes.
Goldenberg. And the reason I ask the question is you can make lemonade out of lemons. You can find in a difficult or a bad situation something to pull out of it. But I think what I'm hearing is a broad consensus that we're looking to the Qataris to end the financing of terror in their country and to be a full partner in fighting terrorism in the region. Is that a fair summary?
It is, but I think it's just as important that we finish off today by noting that we need the other GCC countries, this kind of coalition of four in particular, to be flexible and allow Qatar some face-saving ways to do this.
That was
and so far, they seem to be kind of pretty hard line that nothing's good enough. And so we absolutely must demand that Qatar make real, substantive, and verifiable change. But in order for that to happen, we're going to have honest conversations with our other allies in the region and kind of insist that they be flexible enough to find a way that Doha can do this, and that's going to have to involve some face-saving gestures. And that's okay so long as the changes are substantive and verifiable.
Thank you, and that's where I was trying to get to. So I appreciate that sentiment, because it is a matter of we have a base in Qatar. It's an important base to the work we're trying to do in the region. The work we're doing is longitudinal. It's not going to be solved overnight, and we need to have a long-term strategy.
Mr. Goldenberg, you referenced, and others did as well, the issue that we have options to look at other places besides Qatar to place our assets. And to the whole panel, as you look at the region, what would be the benefits to us to having a more diversified platform than just the base in Qatar?
Sure. I mean, I think there is definitely, Congressman, a benefit. There's always a benefit to having more diverse options. We have other options in the region. We have options in Central Asia. We have a base in the UAE. We have a base in Bahrain. So the more options you have, the less leverage any one of these actors has over us. At the same time, I think we'd have to do a real evaluation, because if we lost the base in Qatar, I mean, they've invested $1 billion in that base during the 90s. That's a ton of money. They do have technology there and sort of runways and space and things we don't necessarily have elsewhere. And so I think it would be, and on top of that, if you end up in a situation where we lose access to the base, then you also start running into questions of not being able to conduct as many operations in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and elsewhere, and also a problem where we could bring in a carrier or something like that to offset some of those problems, but then you lose ability to do things in the Asia Pacific or in Europe. And so it's a very complicated question, but it's certainly worth exploring instead of making it just a sacred cow. Because whenever you make something a sacred cow and it becomes invaluable to you, then you have a lot less leverage over everything else. One other point, if I could just add on what Matt was saying, which I think is just important to also weigh, I really do think we need to focus on getting all of our friends in the region to de-escalate this crisis, because you just go back and look at it. The president went in May, and the whole conference in Riyadh was about basically ISIS, Islamic extremism, and Iran. And what have we been doing for 2 months now with these guys? What is Secretary Tillerson doing when he goes out to a week to the GCC? What are we talking about here today? We're talking about the fight they're having amongst each other. If they're spending 90% of their time, which I've had diplomats tell me, I'm spending 90% of my time on this issue, they're not spending time thinking about all the other things we want them to think about and what we want to think about. So I think that's a really important piece of trying to de-escalate this and trying to find a solution, even as we push them on the terrorism.
Thank you. I think that's an important point. My last line is, as we're doing that, as we're balancing all these different issues, consistency of message on our part, transparency on the part of the Qataris. What is the impact of the divergent message or inconsistent messages coming out of the administration having on our ability to move forward in this region? Dr. Schanzer?
Look, I think it's clear that we have a couple of different messages that are coming out. We're hearing, on the one hand, that this crisis is not an urgent issue for the administration to handle, and then at the same time, that it's something that we do want to have handled. I think there is perhaps some of the actors in the region believe they have a free hand to act when they hear parts of the administration speak, and then perhaps feel more constrained. I think consistency is going to be important here. I personally believe that we should be sending a message to the Qataris that we demand change, and that ought to be the first thing that we say, and then to follow up with that by saying, and as we demand this change, you, the other 4 actors involved in this crisis, can stand down while we take over. And that, I think, would be the way to get this to a soft landing. It perhaps would be one of the face-saving sort of mechanisms that Matt discussed here today. But I would like to see more American leadership on this if possible.
To use your analogy, though, as well, the Ferrari and the other cars also speeding, is it fair to say that we need to have expectations of all of our allies in the region that they are addressing the terror
100%.
issues? Okay. Dr. Levitt, to you.
Yeah, I just say in my conversations with officials of the past weeks, it's very clear that the conflicting messages coming out of the administration are affecting them. I've spoken to people on both sides of this intra-GCC conflict, and each clearly feel that they can listen to the part that is saying what they want to hear. I've also been in Europe recently, and in conversations with counterterrorism officials there, they've been asking me, and I'm no longer a government official, what does Washington really think? And so our allies are confused as to what our position is. I think there are other ways that we can do face-saving gestures. I think Jonathan is absolutely right. If we play more of a role, there's more likelihood that things will move forward. We just agreed on a memorandum of understanding with Qatar. Again, there's not a lot of meat on the bones of that. That's fine. Let this be a mechanism through which we say, through guarantees to us, and let's bring others in, the EU, others, Qatar is going to make the following changes. Qatar has to be willing to agree to make those changes and to do it in verifiable ways. And then we can go to the Emiratis and the Saudis in particular and say, hey, this is how it's going to be done, and this is what the verification is going to look like, but the Qataris have to be willing to make those changes and to do it in such a way that will be verifiable.
Great. I see that I'm out of time. I appreciate the extended time. I do agree with it. We have to be clear in our expectations, clear in our strategy, and working with all our allies in the region. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. DeSantis of Florida.
Thank the chairman. Dr. Schanzer, how would you describe Qatar's relationship with Iran?
Uneasy, although also a bit more ambiguous than perhaps what has been previously described. Uneasy in the sense that they're a small country, they're a weak country, and they're looking across the Persian Gulf at a powerful country that's on the precipice of a nuclear weapon, and they need to figure out a way to get along with this neighbor, especially one where they share this natural gas field. So that, I think, explains in general the dynamic. But we have been hearing that there could be more cooperation than was previously seen. I mean, this is essentially what the Gulf Quartet has been alleging against Qatar, that it has been working with the Iranians or perhaps with its proxies. I've heard allegations not just of Hamas, where we know that there has been sort of cooperation on all fronts, but also potentially Hezbollah, potentially the Houthis in Yemen. We've heard these things. There's not a lot of evidence yet to prove these things, but it is certainly something worth watching.
There are also reports, I think, that Qatari money has ended up in Iraq with some of the Iranian-backed militia groups there.
Correct.
What about the Muslim Brotherhood and the relationship that Qatar has with the Brotherhood? I read your testimony, and you had wrote about some of the people that Qatar was really supportive of the Morsi government in Egypt after Mubarak was pushed out. But then when General al-Sisi took over, that Qatar was kind of a haven for some of these people. And I have heard reports that some of these really radical clerics, like Sheikh Qaradawi, who's one of the biggest Muslim Brotherhood clerics, is in Qatar. So is that true? A lot of those folks who were involved with the Brotherhood government now have refuge in Qatar?
100%. And in the previous Gulf crisis, there was one 3 years ago. One of the demands of Qatar was that they exile some of these Muslim Brotherhood figures, that they expel them from the country. But when you look at what the Qataris invested in Egypt during that 1 year plus of Morsi rule, it was reportedly $18 billion. It was a real significant investment. You look at their support for various actors in Syria. They were definitely throwing their weight behind the Brotherhood there in the early years of the uprising. The Nahda party in Tunisia, Qataris are big supporters there. The Muslim Brotherhood in Libya. It is, I think at this point, undeniable that the Qataris are the #1 supporter financially and politically of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Muslim world. I think Turkey's probably #2, not as much financially, but more politically, although perhaps a bit of both. But this is really the cornerstone of the debate, as I see it, between Qatar and its neighbors, that the neighbors are furious because they do not want to see the Muslim Brotherhood come to power, and they believe that the Qataris continue to finance and support the Brotherhood in many theaters.
So what's their reason for doing that? I mean, it's a very wealthy country. The regime, I mean, just the royal, a huge wealth. Is it just ideologically that's what they want to do? Because it seems like it's caused them a lot of problems in the region.
I agree that it's caused them problems, and I would say that at this point, when you look at what's happened throughout this crisis, it looks like a gamble that has not paid off. And I think many of the other gambles throughout the Arab Spring, it looks like a lot of money that has effectively gone to waste. But they see this as their leverage, a counter leverage to their Gulf neighbors with whom they have a pretty significant rivalry. And it's their way of, I think, punching above their weight, as Matt had mentioned. And so they continue to pursue this. I think there's certainly an ideological approach here, though, as well.
Do you guys, sorry, I get you guys in. I've actually run out of time, but do you guys have any insights into the Brotherhood relationship, or did he cover everything?
Sorry, I mean, I think Jonathan described, I mean, there is this relationship. It's a long historical relationship. I think, I'm more skeptical about it, how much of it is ideological and how much of it is more just geopolitical, playing, the Qatari overall third way. If it was really deeply ideological, why would they also build a really strong relationship with us at the same time? To me, it's more of like, they don't want to play the same role. They don't want to just follow the Saudis. They want to be an independent actor in the Gulf. And so they're going to just pursue an open door policy that welcomes all kinds of different players, some of which we can work with, including ourselves, some of which are a huge problem. And so that's the motivation. It doesn't necessarily explain the behavior, or excuse the behavior, which I think, again, sometimes they can be useful to us on some of these things, but a lot of times we need to press them harder to stop.
Great. I'm out of time, and I'll yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. DeSantis. Sheila, and now we're so pleased that two members who are not on our subcommittee, but I know that they're very interested in this issue, and I'm very pleased to yield to them. And we will start with Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Let me thank the chairwoman for her leadership and the ranking member for their leadership of this committee and the important testimony that's been given by the witnesses. I'm in the same predicament, though I've been able to listen to the testimony for a while. I'm in a markup and may be called to a vote as I speak. But I will rush very quickly to thank the witnesses. But I really want to speak to Mr. Goldenberg, if I might. I noticed that the title of the hearing is the Assessing the U.S.-Qatar Relationship, which I think is extremely important. So if you might bear with me, I'm going to ask questions more or less in a loyalty factor. Would you indicate or confirm that, and I'm just going to go back as far as the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and Obama. In those administrations, would you venture to say that Qatar engaged positively with the United States? In Bill Clinton, I'm just going to get you yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. George W. Bush?
Yes.
And President Obama. So if you just wanted a blanket assessment, that was a positive relationship between the United States and Qatar on some of the issues that they were addressing.
I would say, yeah. I would say that they are, look, I think Congresswoman, I think that we have a good relationship with them on a number of issues. The most important, I think, being the air base. But beyond that, when we ask them to do things, they often do them.
And forgive me, and call to a vote. During the Bush administration, do you have a recollection, or by news or your research, that then Secretary of State asked them to engage with Hamas?
I don't know, but one of my colleagues might know better than me.
Okay. So you mentioned, or in the discussion we've mentioned, that the region is an important region. I, from the lawyer's perspective, say that none of them in the court of equity are there with totally clean hands. And I would offer to say that stability is important, security is important. And in your testimony, I'd like you to repeat what you said about engaging so that we can encourage the stability. I understand the list has now been, in essence, pared down to about 6 of the demands. But how would it be best for us to effectuate that engagement where all of the parties recognize that there are elements of their policy dealing with terrorists that should be eliminated?
Sure. I mean, I think that the most important thing, and Matt's brought this up a couple times during the hearing, this question of the MOU being a good starting point, setting one bar for everyone to meet on the question of terror financing would be, I think, very valuable, because the Kuwaitis are a problem, the Qataris are a problem, maybe the Saudis are getting better, but there's a long history there and a long way to go. The UAE has also had its issues, and so holding them all and saying the United States will hold them all to one standard and applying that standard across all of them, I think becomes beneficiary to us in terms of dealing with the overall challenge, and also helps to alleviate this crisis amongst them. And then I think also just in terms of dealing with stability and dealing with the region, it's really hammering home the point that we're not going to want to spend all of our time dealing with this inter-scene conflict that they have amongst themselves. It's time to get back to the bigger issues that threaten their stability and threaten our stability, the things that really draw us into the region, whether that's ISIS, extremism, some of the things that Iran does in the region that are problematic. That's where I would really just like to see the relationship spend more.
So any interjection by Congress for placing punitive measures on one or the other, and in this instance maybe Qatar, would you view that as a positive act?
I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would recommend having a standard that Congress applies to everyone across the board. And Qatar might, as Jonathan said, the analogy, Qatar might have the fastest, might be the 90-mile-an-hour Ferrari, and so they're going to have longer to go.
And let me follow up with my, I think, almost concluding question. Emboldening one over the other. I happen to have been in the region during the visit of the administration and meeting with, at that time, the President of Egypt and discussing these issues. I have a very strong commitment to the region for its security relationship to Israel, which we want to ensure their safety. And would you make the argument that, as you just said, focusing our attention on the larger picture and trying to ensure the stability of the region by way of setting a certain standard, would that be helpful in terms of making sure the region remains stable for other big fights and also the security of Israel?
Yeah, I think it would, and I think also, Congressman, you mentioned the issue of emboldening. I do think that we made a mistake by essentially signaling a green light and a blank check to the Saudis with the president's visit to the region, and basically led them to believe that there was nothing that they could do wrong, and so they did this. Where the stronger message, I think, would have been, we'll take a tougher stand on the issues you care about, whether it's Iran or I would not advocate for walking away from the nuclear deal. I think that we should stick in the nuclear deal, but you want to take a harder stance towards Iran's behavior in the region. You want us to do more on counterterrorism. We'll do that, but we also expect you to clean up some of your act, and we have expectations of you. This isn't a blank check. This is a quid pro quo or an agreement between a relationship between two partners. And so I think that was part of the problem that out of that trip.
Let me thank the chair lady. Thank you all for your testimony. Forgive me for my focused questioning, but let me thank the chair lady for her kindness. And I like the blank check analysis that we should not give and that we should work together for harmony. I like that word as well in the region. I thank you so very much, and I yield back to the gentlelady.
We're thrilled that you were able to join us. And Ms. Maloney, if you could hold your fire for just a few minutes, because Mr. Connolly, who is on our subcommittee, is back with us. So we're going to yield time to him now. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
I thank the chair. Dr. Schanzer, when your opening statement, you made some allusion to a reference to maybe paid lobbyists for governments in the region had descended on our offices or paid a visit. I'm not sure I understood the point of that or what you were getting at, but I want to give you the opportunity to explain. Because, I mean, there are lots of lobbyists for lots of countries, including Israel, that descend on our offices, and we don't necessarily import to that anything negative by way of inference. Were you suggesting?
No,
in this particular case,
there's nothing illegal or unseemly about it. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that there is a lot of it right now.
That what?
There's a lot of it right now. There's a lot of noise. We're seeing a lot of different actors weigh in.
But I'm sorry, because I don't know. Did you mean about Oman? Excuse me, Qatar?
About this Qatar conflict, but I think in general, when we look at the permissive nature of what we've allowed to take place across this region, in my view, it has been the direct result of yielding to these actors. In other words, over time, this has become sort of the boiling frog, although I heard the other day that that actually is not scientific, that frogs actually can be boiled. They won't jump out. But regardless, what I would say is that over time, we have come to just accept the fact that there is that there are terror financiers running around in Qatar, that there are terror financiers running around in Kuwait, and we're being asked to look the other way. That over time we've grown used to this because they have engaged with us on deals to buy weapons, on investments here in the United States, and because they have a face here in Washington. And what I would like to do is to try to look beyond the messaging and to get back to the facts here, which is that we have problematic relations.
Right, but could it not also be because we also have bases? We have troops stationed there. I mean, we have the largest base in the region in Qatar.
We do. And the
I
question
mean,
of,
maybe we have conflicting interest here. I'm
we
not
do.
justifying anyone's behavior, but it's not a simple matter of paid lobbyists who are influencing us here because a lot of money's flowing around. It's because actually we're looking at U.S. interests in the region and we see a conflict.
But I would actually argue in response to that, that one of the reasons why we've been able to keep that base, or how the Qataris have been able to keep that base, is that we continue to hear that, well, gosh, they're doing all these other wonderful things, and they're helping us out. So, you know, we'll deal with this terror finance problem quietly over here. Let's not deal with it. Now, look, 10 years later, and we still have this problem. We now have a full-blown crisis. My argument is that we have not dealt honestly with the problem of terrorism finance in Qatar for a long time, and I would argue that we probably haven't dealt honestly with the terror finance problems of some of those other countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to go that route, I'd add to your list. I mean, I'd add the Saudis. Financing Wahhabism and madrasas all over the world that have fomented enormous amounts of terrorism and extremism, one could argue. Okay, Mr. Goldenberg, you talked about the conflicting messages from the President and Secretary of State with respect to this conflict, and I have to agree with you. I'm just wondering, added to that, like, what is the policy, and should we be doing it by tweet? Different, but a hollowed-out State Department, only 2 of 22 assistant secretaries even nominated, the ambassador in Doha resigning, and arguing that because increasingly it's difficult to wake up overseas and try to explain what the hell is going on in Washington, D.C. and what it means as the ambassador, and of course a proposed 32% cut to state and aid. Just spitballing here, could that have something to do with our inability to effect some kind of understanding and agreement and reconciliation among the GCC?
Well, I'll say that, yeah, I think that's a huge problem that you have all these vacancies, and it's a good example of the fact that Secretary Tillerson had to go over there on his own for 4 days. I'm not sure I would have recommended that. I don't think this issue necessarily merits that unless you actually think you're going to have an agreement, or unless you're going to have some kind of breakthrough, and it was very obvious to those of us watching it that you weren't going to have an agreement. So I do think that in a situation like that, though, who else do you send, though? You pretty much have nobody, especially the assistant secretaries, you know, somebody who worked at the State Department for a number of years. You know, in every department and every agency, and I've worked on a couple, there is that key level in the middle, that the individual who is senior enough to be able to reach up to the Secretary of State and, like, get in front of them immediately and inform them, and still close enough to the worker bees and the people working and the experts in the agency who can reach down and pull in. At the State Department, those are the assistant secretaries. They are the key, in my view, node. And the fact that they don't exist means there's no connectivity between the entire department and the expertise and the secretary. So yeah, I think that it harms us on this issue and pretty much all issues.
And Madam Chairman, Lois Frankel had a question. If I could ask it on her behalf,
we would be
and that
honored
way
to have you ask it on her
we save
behalf.
5 minutes, you know.
Please go ahead and
All right.
ask.
So Lois's question, Ms. Frankel's question, and I'll put it to you first, Mr. Goldenberg. Would the removal of our military base give license to or make worse the behavior in question?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it precisely that way. It may. I think the bigger challenge logistically would be that if we were to remove the military base, it would, first of all, be incredibly costly. The Qataris spent $1 billion on that base, so you got to look at what the alternatives are. It would then strain our ability to conduct operations at the same tempo in Iraq, Afghanistan.
I don't think that's the question.
Oh, yeah.
I think the question is, implied here, by having the military base in Qatar, does it moderate behavior? Would it be worse without it, assuming there's any bad behavior at all?
Maybe. I mean, so yes, but I would argue it sort of works both ways. I think I agree with the notion that if we had no relationship with, this would basically dramatically shrink our relationship with Qatar and then reduce our leverage over them. It would also reduce their leverage over us. So there's a bit of two sides to it. So it's a hard sort of hypothetical to make. But I think the better option at this point is not to now that the military base is there, it's to not walk away from it for all those reasons, but to also clarify that we have other options, so this isn't a gun they can just hold to our head. I think that's where we need to be on this question.
Dr. Levitt, and then my time's up. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
So right now, we often look at the base as too big to fail, and we need it so badly that we don't really use it as much leverage. And we need to begin to use it as some leverage. If we suddenly woke up tomorrow and there was no base, we would lose a lot of leverage, yes, but we would still have plenty of other areas where we have a relationship with Qatar. In the best of circumstances, I certainly hope that we don't move the base. But I think Ilan is right that we should start looking at what other options might be to move some or all of it, not because we want to, but just to signal that it's not us who are over a barrel by virtue of having the base there. They're not necessarily over a barrel either, but it's a relationship. And I don't think we really use it for very much leverage right now.
I would agree that we need the leverage. And what I recommend in my written testimony is that we need to do an assessment. It's not to say that we need to leave, although I do think the arrangement is not sustainable. It's not, I think, the right message that we should be sending to the rest of the region. But this does not have to be binary. We can move some assets out of that base because we decide that we need to redistribute and we can't rely too much on the Qataris. Or we might say, look, we can't move anything. But at the very least, and I think, by the way, this hearing is doing a lot of good. The Qataris know right now that we're talking about whether or not we should move the base, whether we should assess moving the base. This is incredibly important. It takes leverage away from them and puts it back in our court.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank
On
you, Mr.
behalf of
Connolly.
myself and Congresswoman Frankel.
Thank you very much. We love to hear Lois's voice, even in absentia. And now we're so pleased to turn to Ms. Maloney. Thank you for your patience in sitting through the subcommittee to be able to ask your question. Thank you, Carolyn. You're always welcome to be a part of our sub.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for allowing me privileges to attend your committee meeting and giving me the opportunity to ask a question. And thank you for having a hearing on a very important issue, which is a top concern to Secretary Tillerson. That is why he personally went to the region, and he has expressed his deep concern about peace and security in the region, not only for Americans in our base, but also for all of our allies. And he's publicly expressed his concern that our allies, these are all allies of America, and that he's concerned that if it continues, it will break up the Gulf Cooperation Council, that has been an important area of cooperation with the United States and our ability to collectively combat ISIS. He also has called for the embargo or the easing of the embargo, as it's harmful to the stability of the region, stability of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and it's difficult for our base. The embargo affects also the American base. So his vision, I believe, is a good one. Would you say that we should figure out how to work together? We are all allies, and the enemy is not each other, but the enemy is ISIS and other terrorist activities in the region. Would you agree with Secretary Tillerson? Mr. Goldberg?
Yeah, I would. I think that that this whole crisis has been a distraction from other things we should be dealing with. I'm not sure I would have put as much into it as he has necessarily, because I think that part of this is these parties have to also solve it themselves and be responsible about that. That we can play, I think, a very positive role in also trying to get them to de-escalate and guaranteeing any agreement and trying to push all of them on terror financing questions. I agree. For our interests, for the U.S. interests, the fact that the last 2 months in the Gulf have been spent on this instead on all the things that we'd prefer to be spending their time on is not good. That's the bottom line. And so it would be better if we can find a way to get over this. Sadly, I think right now there's no indicators that in the near term that's going to happen, so that we need to at least start managing the situation and also getting all of these different actors to at least tone down their public rhetoric and maximalist demands, so that a few months from now, after things cool down, maybe privately they can start to come to some deals.
Well, he's begun focusing on terrorism financing, which I believe is a way forward. And I understand that he has created certain criteria already for the Gulf nations to cooperate with them, and I hope that they all will. That would be a huge step forward on allowing access to their financial tracking of where money's going. If you crack down on the terrorism financing, then you're cracking down on terrorism. Are you aware of any agreements that the State Department has made with these countries to combat terrorism financing? I was told that Qatar has entered into an agreement to share their database, to share their information, to combat terrorism financing. Are you aware of that?
I am, but I think, Matt, I don't know if you want to, Matt's the real expert on this question.
So first of all, thank you for your questions. I want to start by pointing out that there's complete consensus across this table in the need to de-escalate this crisis. And as Elon said, we need to be focusing on the other more important issues. Several of us have also said that some of the charges arrayed against Qatar are baseless, but some of them are very much grounded in truth, and they affect all those other issues.
But my question is, are you aware of agreements, concrete agreements, between Qatar and the United States, or Saudi Arabia and the United States, or Bahrain, or AEU, or any of the countries specifically to work together to combat terrorism financing?
Yeah, so that's what I was getting at. There are many agreements. There have been several that have been going on for years, bilateral and otherwise. There are two new ones. One came out of the Riyadh summit, which was the agreement to set up a Terror Finance Tracking Center, the TFTC. There is no meat on those bones yet. If you look at the Treasury statements, they have lots of great ideas. I've spoken to some of the people who wrote those statements. They're aspirational, but there is great foundation there upon which we could build. And in my previous statements, I've already pointed to that as something that we could use as a face-saving gesture to move forward and out of this crisis.
I think that's a great idea, Dr. Levitt. We should appeal to all of these countries to join us in combat specifics on how we would fight terrorism financing. And I personally want to thank Secretary Tillerson for entering in with his entire effort to personally try to solve this. We're talking about allies. We need to get together. And I'm not aware of any other country that wants to host the U.S. military. I just recall being invited to leave one country very quickly. We were told to leave Saudi Arabia, and I'm not aware that any other country in the region wants to host a U.S. military. Are you aware of any other country that wants us to come in and be there, Dr. Levitt?
Well, we do have bases in the UAE and in Bahrain, so it's not like this is the only base we have. And I don't think the base is the ultimate issue. If I could just add, there is one other agreement. As you noted, Secretary Tillerson signed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding with Qatar. This too, there's absolutely no meat on these bones, but they're very good bones, and there's more that could be built on them. I don't want people to walk away thinking, oh, now there's an MOU, so now we can cooperate.
I think that's a very important issue, Dr. Levitt, and what you could do to help us is give us exactly what kind of meat should be added to that bone, and then we should present a detailed agreement on combating terrorism financing to all of the countries in the region and see who will cooperate with us in a specific way. I must tell you, it is deeply important to me. I represent the great city of New York and lost 500 friends. We lost 3,000 on that day, but literally thousands and thousands more that were exposed to the deadly fumes from the terrorist attack. So we know that there are efforts to attack New York and other cities in our, including this city. We have intelligence on that, and other cities, and anything we can do with our allies to combat terrorism can save future lives in America and other places. And I, for one, support Secretary Tillerson's effort to end the crisis. Let's join hands. Let's combat terrorism. Let's combat terrorism financing. Because if they can't finance their activities, they can't attack us. I represent a district that just 6 months ago, 2 bombs went off. So you ask, where did they get the money for the bombs? How did they learn how to put them together? Who helped them? So terrorism financing is very important, I think, to the world, and especially to the United States, and especially to New York City, which remains the #1 terrorist target in our country. So I want to thank all of you for your work in combating terrorism financing, and I would welcome any ideas of how we could put more strength behind efforts to combat it. And I think that if we combat it, we would also strike against the financing of terrorism activities in other countries, which allegedly, I was listening to my colleagues in their questioning, were very concerned about, and where they're teaching, terrorism, and we need to stop that. But my time is way, way over. I want to thank you for being here, and thank you for your work, and thank you for everything you've done to make the world safer. And thank you.
Thank you, Ms.
Madam
Maloney.
Chair, and I don't know if I'll have the chance to publicly say in your committee meeting how very, very sad I am that you have decided to retire and leave us. You've been an incredible leader.
I'm going to miss all of our colleagues.
Wonderful. Your leadership on this committee and as chairman of this committee has been extraordinary.
Greatest honor of my
First
life.
woman to head this as the chair. We're very proud of you, Eliana.
Thank you, Ms. Maloney. Thank you so much. And feel free to come back to our subcommittee. You're a valuable member. We'll make you an ex officio member. Thank you. And I just have one last wrap-up question. I know you gentlemen have been testifying for hours now, but Dr. Schanzer, this tension has been going on for such a long time. Why do you think that its neighbors decided to take action only now? Is there something else that you believe precipitated this?
Madam Chairman, thank you for the question. It's really one of the questions that I think we all should have been asking all along. I think when you talk to most analysts in this town, they'll just tell you, well, they hate each other, and it was the Brotherhood, and it was the Arab Spring. Well, what made this thing erupt in the spring? There were some reports that it was perhaps because the Qataris had paid ransom and that money went to Shiite militias as well as to bad actors in Syria. But there have also been some recent reports that have surfaced recently, and there is a little bit of confusion over this, but I think it's worth unpacking. There was a report from the UAE ambassador to Russia. He went on BBC and claimed that the Qataris provided intelligence about Emirati and Saudi troop movements in Yemen, and that this led directly to the death of dozens of Gulf soldiers in the Yemeni operation. I've also heard from 3 different sources since then that it may not have been al-Qaeda that they shared this information with, but rather the Houthis and the Saleh forces in Yemen. This would be devastating for Qatar if this were to be true, because of course it would mean that they were sharing information with Iranian proxies, which is an absolute red line for the Gulf states. So this allegedly happened in the spring. I've not been able to confirm it with a U.S. official. All I can tell you is that this is what I've been hearing from people who generally know in this town.
Well, thank you very much, and I thank the audience and the witnesses for their patience. Excellent testimony. You will forgive me that I was gone a little bit from the podium. We had our bill up on the floor calling upon Iran to release the hostages, the American hostages who are citizens and residents, and we were overwhelmingly approved, so that's why I was absent. And with that, our subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you to all.